Really stunning. All right, let's start with this. This is Tucker Carlson. We're going to play two clips from his opening monologue, which is pretty impressive even for him. Now, to be fair, this is a guy who's head writer for almost 4 years, was a guy who was regularly posting on white supremacist websites and talking about how much of his work was the foundation of every script that Tucker Carlson writes. Now it's so, and you know what? I mean, maybe the guy's not on Fox's payroll anymore, but it's not like I'm seeing a lot of him on like social media going like, I have no job. I don't know. It's one of those things where, you know, there's a lot of ways of getting paid. And it's not unheard of, let's put it this way, for stars of you know, commentary shows like Tucker Carlson's to have their own cadre of writers. Still a business expense, but here we go.
What's amazing is how cynical it is. People who say this don't even pretend to believe it. They ignore their own slogans. If you really thought America was a white supremacist dystopia, a place where people of color get murdered just for going outdoors, as the Democratic platform suggests is true, then you probably wouldn't encourage millions of non-white immigrants to move here. You'd be too worried about their safety. Bringing in people from Africa, for example, would be tantamount to premeditated murder. You wouldn't want that on your conscience. Of course, in real life, it's all fake. The opposite is true, in fact. Africans thrive in this country. Nigerian immigrants to the United States earn more money on average than native-born Americans. Nigerian immigrants are also more likely to get college degrees than people who grew up here. If what BLM is telling us is true, how could this happen? Well, because they're lying. For the overwhelming majority of lower-income Americans, melanin is not the main barrier to advancement. Education and social class are.
It's an interesting struck. Now, we also know that coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, melanin also dovetails with those areas where people live and their educational opportunities and their opportunities to get health care and their opportunities to get food and whatnot. It is
or make
not
it home without being shot by a cop.
Indeed. And so there is Tucker Carlson. Even the BLM people know, they don't even believe that there's white supremacy in this country. It's just completely made up. I wonder where people got this idea. Here is Tucker Carlson 4 minutes later, maybe not 4, maybe 3, talking about history.
7 years after an anarchist assassinated the president of the United States, William McKinley. He was Roosevelt's running mate. In some ways, 1908 isn't so different a period in American history as the one we're living through right now. In 1908, America was fast becoming an unstable country. Mass immigration had made the society far less cohesive. New technology completely upended the way people lived and the way they worked. There was a recession underway in 1908, coupled with high unemployment. People were angry at the banks, at big business, angry at capitalism itself. And there was also racial unrest. During one race riot in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, mobs burned buildings and attacked citizens in their homes. More than a dozen people died. 1908 was a chaotic moment, so not surprisingly, some people became radical. They called themselves anarchists. They believed in violence. In February of that year, an anarchist shot a priest to death during communion at church in Denver. He cited no reason for doing it. He just said he hated Christianity. A few weeks later, another anarchist tried to assassinate the chief of police of Chicago at his home. Later that month, anarchists staged a deadly riot in a park in Manhattan.
Let's just stop at the Springfield race riot that he was talking about, where people burned down all sorts of things. Wow, that's interesting. The part that he didn't tell you about was that this race riot was specifically really about targeting people of one race, people who were black. And there was almost 5,000 white Americans who, over the course of a couple of days in August in 1908, murdered a bunch of black people and burned down their section of town in this completely fictional white supremacist country that we have. You just sort of left that part out.
Not an isolated phenomenon either. Think about
Nope.
the Tulsa massacre. This happened all over the United States.
This was an era starting in like the Reconstruction era, where we had the rise of the KKK. By 1920, we're talking about 6 million out and proud KKK members. This is when all of those Confederate statues went up in every town and around the country, in places that weren't even the South. Just all of a sudden, 40, 50 years later, they're remembering their heritage that in some cases wasn't even their heritage, unless the heritage had less to do with the cultural, the sort of like, I don't know, mint juleps or whatever it was the people were drinking in the South at that time, and more had to do with the suppression of a race of people to serve as free labor and to subjugate themselves to the dominant race in this country. That's the part that I think people were probably reminiscing about and want to remind people of who's in charge. And here, we're going to actually build a statue just to remind you. The South is going to rise again, as it was. And lastly, since we're talking about...
Can I throw in just one idea there, Sam, before we go
Sure.
on? When we talk about the antebellum South and this history of race in this country, I've always just find it really important to remind people that there are more Americans enslaved today in 2020, legally enslaved, than there were at the height of the antebellum South. And the way that happens is in prison. Prison slavery is, just like forced servitude in the antebellum period, an object of industrial interest. And when we talked about whether it's, capital kicking future generations off a climate cliff by opposing a New Deal, a Green New Deal, whether it's capital supporting wars for profit to fill the pockets of defense manufacturers, whether it's capital forcing people to forced servitude for generations, or whether it's capital replicating those systems of forced labor through incarceration. In each of these cases, we see capital emerge with its own independent, enduring influence. And it lurks in the shadows. And when we, just to riff on another piece that we talked about, propaganda, when you see propaganda, any media institution that doesn't acknowledge the role of capital in driving everything from federal policy to our wars is propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And we should say that dynamic of slavery in prisons was a very explicit measure. It was a negotiation. The 13th Amendment, written during Reconstruction. Well, we'll get rid of slavery except in prison. And, there's a lot of things. You guys are in charge of the laws. So, if you really need that labor, this is the way that you get it. And there it is. I mean, this is not in other words, this is not a perspective that this is slavery in these prisons. It is literally an explicit, the 13th Amendment says that you can only have slavery in one instance now. And that is when people are in prison.
It really blew my mind when I found out about that.
What words are, but I think it's like indentured servitude can only
That's a condition of punishment.
Except as a punishment. And we're also going to make a bunch of new laws that allow us to criminalize Black people for basically anything.